Chapter 5 Ships and Sharks and Factory Boats. At home, Tomas's alarm clock was Gallo, the fighting cock that lived next door. His crowing, like that of all the cocks of Laredo, sounded like enchilada, not cock-a-doodle-doo. Tomas awakened and looked up at the mosaic of palm leaves on the ceiling and waited for the next alarm to go off. Presently he heard it, the ding-dong of the mission bells. To the fishermen of Colonia Zaragoza, this early call to Mass was their call to the water. Tomas did not move. More alarms were to come. The dogs barked next. First Papo, who lived across the street, then Bruja, a homeless dog who had made a living along the main road to Laredo. From the other side of the arroyo, Osado, the bank manager's dog, tuned in with a sharp retort. Then all the dogs greeted the day. Their concert was followed by silence. Tomas waited. One more voice was to be heard. At last it came. 7 high yips. Macho, Jose's dog, was speaking. Tomas got up. Dolores had already lit the mesquite twigs on the sand table. The light from the flames danced over the walls and ceiling of the palapa like wind-blown quetzal feathers. "Grandmamma," Tomas said, "I'm going to take our little Ponga and go to the island today." "You cannot at this moment," she answered, dipping her hand into the cornmeal canister. "Miguel has already taken it to the Carmen Island to get salt at the salt mine." Tomas frowned and thought for a moment. "Then I will catch a ride with Zorro. He works on Saturday and Sunday." Dolores made no comment. She picked up a piece of saltfish that had been soaking in water overnight and placed it in a frying pan. To Tomas, her silence seemed to ask for an explanation. "I will spear you a sea bass," he said, avoiding the real reason. "I'm almost as good as my father at spearing fish." Dolores still did not say anything. She did not disapprove of Tomas's plan. She just no longer felt it proper to tell Tomas what he could and could not do. He was 14. "I'm off," he announced. "Tell Grandpapa I've gone to the island." "I'll tell him when he awakens. It may be noon," she said. "He did not sleep well last night. His legs are bothering him again. It's the circulation, the nurse at the infirmary told him." Reference to ailments and sickness were not to Tomas's liking. He would rather not hear about them. Hastily he pocketed a leftover stuffed pepper and kissed his grandmother goodbye. The cardinal, whose mate had built a nest in the edible bean tree, sang his pretty bird song to her as Tomas walked out the gate. Papo barked and crossed the street to join Tomas as he ran past Jose's casa. Halfway along, the sound of an outboard motor sent Tomas's feet flying. He arrived at the water's edge, only to see Zorro well on his way to the sea. No one else was around. Tomas sat cross-legged on an overturned boat and thought about what to do next. Griselda came to mind. He would ask her to get him a ride to the island in one of Victorio's sport fishing boats. Tomas started up the road with Papo at his heels, wagging his tail in the joy of being in Tomas's presence. On his return, he again passed Jose's house, without stopping to ask if it had been he who had set off the tremendous firecrackers last night. It had to be, and he was in a hurry. At the edge of the arroyo, Papo ran into Bruja, the yellowish dog with the weary muzzle, who owned the territory along the road. Both dogs rushed at each other and sniffed noses and tails while circling with bristling ruffs and exposed canine teeth. Tomas left Papo working out the politics of just who was boss dog. In the middle of the arroyo, Tomas stopped. He glanced up the dry riverbed to the distant trees and remembered that he needed a shaft for his spearhead. The trees were straighter on the arroyo bank than on the island, and he headed out to find one. Picking his route carefully in the semi-darkness, he made his way toward the mountains. He knew the arroyo well. He and Jose caught rattlesnakes here, and although it was too cool for them to be out this morning, he avoided their lairs. He also knew the arroyo chipmunks. Raya, who lived under the twisted mesquite log, would eat out of his hand when he called him. Tomas squeaked when Raya did not appear. It had been cold enough for a blanket last night. Raya would still be underground in his warm, grassy nest. Tomas put a mesquite bean by his door and went on. On the top of a clump of organ pipe cactus sat a magnificent caracara, the 2-foot-high falcon that is the national emblem of Mexico. He was flapping his wings, preparing them for flight. His long legs and bare red face were barely visible in the low light, but Tomas could see his white neck well. It shone like a pearl necklace below his black cap and above his black and brown body. The caraca cackled harshly. Tomas saluted him. As he hurried along, the plants told him he was leaving the coast and heading toward the mountains. The morning glory vines and pencil-like acatillo became more abundant, and the horizon was not just stippled, but forested with the giant cardon cactus. Most of these telephone poles of chlorophyll and spines stood 40 feet tall. Tomas did no more than glance at them. He was searching for hardwood trees, not cacti, particularly for green, leafy trees. A 2-year drought had forced the trees to drop their leaves to prevent precious water from evaporating from their surfaces. As they bent toward the slightest moisture, the trees had twisted. Tomas wanted a straight tree, and he knew where to find one. Most of the water that rushed through the arroyo after the winter and summer cloudbursts drained into the sea, but some of it sank into the ground and was held in subterranean reservoirs of pebbles and sand. Over these spots, the elephant and jatropha trees were green, and the palo blanco grew straight. When Tomas saw the control tower at the Laredo airport, he climbed the bank, walked into a grove of trees with feathery green leaves, and looked around. Several stalks were possibilities, but one palo blanco was perfect. With his knife, he cut off 5 feet of it and returned to the road to Laredo. Bruja joined him, his ears bleeding from the encounter, but apparently the victor. Papo was not to be seen. Bruja took up the position at Tomas's heels and trotted along in the dust. Having once been fed half a burrito by Tomas, he never forgot his dear friend and joined him whenever he had the opportunity. Laredo was waking as they came into town. Senora Madero was sweeping the grassless clay outside her palapa, and her son was in the street watering the dirt road to keep down the dust that would soon be stirred up by the traffic. The stores would not open until 10. They would close at noon, reopen at 4 o'clock, and stay open until the restaurants and bars closed in the small hours of the morning. Tomas stopped before the window of Stereolandia, a store that to him was a glimpse of the United States. The shelves and floors were stacked with radios, television sets, cassette players, washing machines, dishwashers, computers, and kitchen devices. They were as unattainable as spaceships. Next door was a palapa with clay floors, boxes, tires, and clothes hanging from lines and poles. Tomas looked from one to the other. Stereolandia was the United States. The palapa was his Mexico. How can two neighbors who lie side by side on the same continent be so very, very different? Tomas asked himself as he looked in the window of Stereolandia. He walked on to the plaza. The mission rose strong, massive, and beautiful on one side. Steps and an unfinished fountain lay on the other. He paused to decide where he would stand to hold up his shark before the great wooden mission door, under the bell tower, right out in the middle of the plaza. He did not have time to make up his mind. The huge shark that lurked under the overhang of the rock reef would not wait forever for him. He jogged on. As he came out onto the seaside road, he saw that it was later than he thought. The pickup trucks were grinding along the shore road, bringing the gringo fishermen from the inns and hotels to Victorio's. He broke into a run. At Victorio's high-walled hacienda and fishing camp, he peered in the gate to see if Griselda was about. In the center of the earthen yard sat a large brick casa surrounded by elegant palapas that were not of mestizo design. They were large and square, with steeple-like roofs. The palm thatch was clipped neatly, like a new haircut. Tomas thought they must have been designed in Hollywood, the U.S. town most talked about in Laredo. Victorio kept his land well. The yard had been freshly swept and raked. Gardens of bright red and yellow flowers were edged with the bones of great whales. Every March the blue whales and gray whales came to the Sea of Cortez. Old ones died or were killed, and their bones would wash up on Baja's rocky coast. Against the dark shore they loomed like great white tombstones, and the fishermen reverently gathered them to decorate their casas and gardens. Griselda was not to be seen, and Tomas went on to the sports fisherman's beach, not quite certain what he was going to do. He did not think he had the courage to ask Victorio for a ride. Victorio was a very important man, not only in Laredo but in Mexico City. He was rich and had political connections in high places in the government. The sun was glowing below the rim of the sea when Tomas arrived at the beach. The morning star was as bright as a headlight. Tomas sat down on an overturned boat and watched Victorio equip the gringos with rods and reels and assign them guides and boats. Perhaps one of the guides would be from Colonia Zaragoza, said Tomas, and Tomas would not be embarrassed to ask him for a ride to the island. One by one the boats were shoved into the water, and one by one they rowed into the sunrise, captained by strange guides from fishing towns north of Laredo. Tomas whittled the tip of his pole shaft to fit into his spearhead and waited. As the last boat was launched, Tomas despaired. He did not know that guide either. But wait! Who was that? He jumped to his feet. One of the people shoving the ponga into the water was Griselda. He could not believe his eyes. A girl doing a man's work. He turned his back so as not to embarrass her. She probably would not want one of her friends to see her launching a boat. Griselda turned around. "Tomas!" she called, and came running to meet him, no more embarrassed by what she had been doing than if she had been sewing robes for the padre. "It's nice to see you," she said, rolling down her sleeves. "I have never seen you on this side of town before. What are you doing here?" For a moment he could not remember just why he was there. He was so stunned by the sight of her launching a boat. She even looked like a water person. Her hair was tied back from her face with a ribbon, and she wore blue jeans. A loose white blouse completed her outfit. He finally thought of something to say. "I was wondering if anyone knows what the oficiales want of the commercial fishermen." "Probably to tell them the good news," Griselda promptly answered. "The good news?" "Yeah, the government has stopped the Japanese factory boats from fishing the Sea of Cortez." "Really?" Tomas exclaimed. "Is that true?" It had never occurred to him that the oficiales could be bearers of good news. "The Japanese are gone? You are sure?" "Oh, yes. Uncle Victorio and Aunt Barbara told me. They have been going to Mexico City every month for almost a year to ask the Minister of Fisheries to keep the factory boats out of the Sea of Cortez. They kept telling him they were ruining the fish and that the Mexicans are suffering. Last night the minister's secretary telephoned Victorio. She said the minister had stopped the factory boats from fishing here. Good news, isn't it?" Tomas was amazed. He found it hard to believe that a Laredo fisherman, even one as rich as Victorio, could speak to someone in the government, and that the Minister of Fisheries had listened to him and done what he'd asked. This was more fantastic than the window at Stereolandia. "If you don't believe me," Griselda said, "come to the hacienda with me. It'll probably be announced on the morning TV news." He pulled his sleeves and they started off. She pulled his sleeves and they started off. "Thank you," he said when they arrived at Victorio's, "but I had better go home. The news will make my family very happy." Griselda started to go to the gate, then turned back. "Have you told Señor Fuertes what you are going to do next year?" Tomas was so overwhelmed with the good news that for a moment he did not know what she was talking about. "You mean about going to high school?" he said, recovering. "Yes, of course. It's important." "I haven't done anything about it," Tomas said. "I'm not sure what I'll do." "Go to school, Tomas. You are very smart," Griselda said. "It's the only way to get out of this pit and live a pleasant life." "What pit?" Tomas asked. "This town," Griselda said, gesturing. "This town?" He was amazed. "It's nice." Griselda shrugged and, shaking her head, walked through the gate. Tomas stood where he was as she crossed the yard and went into the grand brick casa. Through the open door he could see a luxurious living room with upholstered chairs and broad couches. The casa must also have bathrooms and an electric stove and washing machine, like those in Stereolandia. Victorio's house was U.S. style, similar to the elaborate brick and tile mansions on Gringo Street. These houses were so far from Tomas's world that he did not even want them. His dreams were of ships and sharks and of factory boats leaving the Sea of Cortez. "A joy has happened," he said, and ran all the way home.